Captain Robert Nairac was a member of the British Army. He was SAS trained. He'd served a period of time in Northern Ireland, and he'd gone undercover one night in May 1977. He was in a bar in South Armagh, a place called the Three Steps Inn. We understand that he was abducted by a number of men. He was taken across the Irish border just a few miles to a place called Ravensdale, where the understanding afterwards is that he was interrogated, that he was beaten, and that he was shot to death. The Troubles in Northern Ireland broke out in 1969. It was Republicans and the IRA predominantly that were taking on the British Army, but the Irish Republican Army were organised in things called cells. They had what they called volunteers. Those volunteers worked across geographic areas, and it wasn't a battle where people would meet and engage in open warfare or in gunfire. It was very much what was known in Northern Ireland. There's a famous book called The Dirty War. An awful lot of it was intelligence, an awful lot of it was guerrilla warfare. So for example, in the area of South Armagh where Robert Nairac was abducted, there were certain places that it wasn't safe for the British Army to go on foot, and they would travel by helicopter. The reason being that Republicans would have planted booby-trap bombs, or would have launched mortars, or would have had snipers who were waiting in the hedges. But the army then, in order to try and counteract that, would try to place intelligence officers, people undercover, to try and find out what was happening. Robert Nairac was probably one of the most famous of those because of the circumstances of his abduction and because of his death. Captain Robert Nairac was a member of the British Army. He was SAS trained. He'd served a period of time in Northern Ireland, and he'd gone undercover as an intelligence officer, and one night in May 1977 he was in a bar in South Armagh, a place called the Three Steps Inn in Drummondtee. He was there. The stories are that because he was undercover, he was engaging in singing Republican songs, and just before 12 o'clock in the evening he went out to the car park, and when he was there we understand that he was abducted by a number of men. He was taken across the Irish border just a few miles to a place called Ravensdale, where the understanding afterwards from testimony given during some trials is that he was interrogated, that he was beaten, and that he was shot to death. The IRA would have abducted him, A, because he was a British soldier, and B, because they wanted to see what information he would have that would be useful to them in their campaign against the British Army. And the very reason that Robert Nairac would have been in that bar on that night is that he was either authorised or unauthorised trying to get information himself that would be useful and provide intelligence to the British Army. So there's a group of people in Northern Ireland known as the Disappeared. Originally, someone like Robert Nairac wasn't included in the Disappeared because he was a soldier. Predominantly the members of the Disappeared were civilians, people who had no official or no known involvement in the Troubles, but these were people who were abducted and interrogated in most cases and killed by Republicans. The allegations that would have been levelled against most of these people were that they were informers, that they were seeking information, that they were passing information on what happened in Republican strongholds to members of the British Army. In a lot of the cases since that's proved to be untrue. Sometimes there were scores to be settled, sometimes there were grudges, sometimes there were personal issues, and sometimes there were fallouts. The Disappeared included about 16 or 17 people, whether or not you include Robert Nairac as a member of the British Army or not. Over the years, there has been information and searches for those people, and now 13 of the 17 bodies have been recovered and have been able to have a burial and to be returned to their families, but there are still 4 of those bodies that are missing, one of whom is Robert Nairac. In each of the other cases, there's been the opportunity to search for a body. There's been information that's been passed on over a period of time from Republicans to the commission that's been set up to look after this, the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains, or have been passed through third parties, maybe members of the clergy or politicians, for example. And the case of Robert Nairac is unique in that he's the only one that there has been no search for the body because there was no information until now. The search began this week in a place called Faughart, which is just in County Louth and Dundalk, the first town in the Republic of Ireland after you cross the border. And the Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains said that they've begun this search because the information they've given, they've checked out the information, they believe it to be credible, they believe it to be worth the search, and so they've now started this week to search on a place called Faughart Hill, which is an ancient battlefield just on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The Commission spoke earlier in the week to the media just before they started the search, and they said that sadly they couldn't be confident that they would find remains. There have been many searches carried out over the last 20 to 25 years from very many members of the disappeared, and there are still some of those who have not been found, maybe because the information is wrong, maybe because through the passage of time, the information has been confused. In the case of Robert Nairac, as I say, this is the first time that any dig has been undertaken. There's no certainty that any remains will be found. Over the years, there have been lots of stories about what happened to Robert Nairac, what happened to his bodies. Local mythology would have said, for example, that after he was shot, his body was put through a meat grinder in order to destroy the evidence. There were 6 people who were convicted of his murder and 3 other people who went on the run around the time of the murder. There was some testimony and some evidence given in those trials, but there's no exact confirmation of the remains of Robert Nairac. So while the family, his 2 surviving sisters in Gloucestershire, where he was from, will hope that they're able to find his body, sadly there's no guarantee for this or any of the others that the physical remains will be found. And indeed, they have warned that because this is a battlefield, it's possible they may uncover other human remains here that won't be those of Robert Nairac. The Troubles began in 1969. The passage of time means that many of the parents and indeed siblings of those who were disappeared have passed away, and there are very many mothers who have gone to the graves not knowing what happened to their sons and daughters, and probably even more poignantly, never being able to give a human funeral to their sons and daughters simply because of the circumstances in which they were members of the disappeared, and because, despite searches, some of those bodies have still yet to be found. In the case of Robert Nairac, predominantly most of those people, well, all of those people who were part of the disappeared apart from Robert Nairac, were what might have been classed as ordinary civilians. Republicans would have viewed Robert Nairac as being part of the opposite force in the war that they were fighting, so there weren't very many people in the area who would have been minded to pass on information. It became something that probably has garnered over the years something of mythological status as well. There had been appeals back as far as 2007. Senior Republican and former Northern Ireland Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness had appealed for anyone with information to pass on that information. It's only now in 2024 that we've got the first piece of credible information. There may have been information passed before to the Commission, but they may have felt that the information that they received wasn't sufficient in order for them to authorise a dig. On this occasion, they have done some research, they've checked the information, they believe that it is valid and it's worth undertaking this search. Because it's on a battlefield, they've had to liaise with the National Museums Authority of the Republic of Ireland as well to see what exactly they can and cannot do on this site. But if they weren't hopeful of at least finding some information and possibly remains, then they wouldn't undertake the search. But I suppose the thing to understand is that there's no guarantee that this will be a fruitful or a successful search, but it is a positive step forward in all of the years since 1977 that finally the Nairac family may be able to find the remains of their loved one.